Good evening, and welcome to Hello, It's Us, Perspectives on Inclusion. This program is dedicated to educating the general public about issues that are important to the disability community. But our premise is that those issues are important to everybody because people with disabilities are certainly an integral part of the general public. Hello, It's Us is brought to you through a collaboration between the University of Iowa Center for Disabilities and Development, Uptown Bill's Coffee Shop, and our good friends here at Public Access Television. My name is Mike Honig. I am a program coordinator at the Center for Disabilities and Development, and I serve as a co-host. And we have a guest host once again today. Caitlin, would you like to?
My name is Caitlin Owens, and I work with Mike at the Center for Disabilities and Development, and I'm sitting in for Keith Ruff.
All right. Well, thanks so much, Caitlin. You're gonna become a regular here on the show, I think, pretty soon. That's great.
Glad to do it.
Yeah. Well, we have a very interesting and timely topic to discuss during today's show. We have two guests, and we're going to ask them to introduce themselves. We have Maggie Ferguson joining us from Des Moines. She's a disability and brain injury program manager with the Iowa Department of Public Health. And we have Jeff Lauer, who is the executive director of the Brain Injury Alliance of Iowa. So welcome to both of you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, Maggie, since you came the furthest, I'd like to go ahead and ask you to start and just tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and what brought you into our focus during this conversation is going to be on brain injury. So if to the extent that you'd like, feel free to share what brought you into an interest in working on behalf and with folks with brain injuries.
Thanks. Well, I started working in the disability field when I was in college, and that career just ended up bringing me to the Brain Injury Alliance several years ago, and then segued over to my role now at the Department of Public Health.
Great, thanks. And Jeff?
Thanks, Mike. Almost 25 years ago here in Iowa City, I was working at a community-based program called Life Skills, and we had people with brain injury approach us for support in re-entry into the community after having cognitive disabilities, and found that we were a provider and I was an individual who was both ignorant and arrogant in terms of trying to provide supports and even understand what it's like to live with a brain injury. And from that point forward, really found that it was an interesting, unserved and underserved population, and have worked for about 20 years, either as a volunteer, as a staff member for the Brain Injury Association of America, and then as executive director of the Brain Injury Alliance of Iowa for the last decade. And somewhat ironically, about a year and a half ago, became the father of a young lady with a brain injury, and so all that theoretical and experience became quite real, and so helps out. So that's how I found my way here.
That's an amazing story. I mean, and you hear that different times, even people in the education profession that maybe they've gone into special ed and then have a son or daughter that experiences a disability. So,
right. So no, it's been really fortunate for our family to not have to enter this community blindly, but it's still the kind of the old adage with brain injury: if you know one person with a brain injury, you know one person with a brain injury. No two brain injuries are alike.
So absolutely. So can you give us either one of you? This is we're going to be very conversational here, but just to give us a sense of the breadth of the population of people with brain injuries, can you tell us at least approximately how many people there are in Iowa living with brain injury and how many injuries occur each year?
Well, there's approximately 95,000 people living with long-term disability because of a brain injury in Iowa, and just over 30,000 brain injuries occur each year.
And that includes, Mike and Caitlin, that includes people who have acquired brain injury, of which traumatic brain injury is a subset. So many people think about brain injury as happening through a car crash or a fall, which are the top two causes of brain injury right now, and concussion, which is quite visible in the news and demanding a lot of response. But then there's a group of people who have non-traumatic brain injury, which could be from a stroke, a deprivation of oxygen called an anoxic event, where the brain doesn't get enough oxygen, perhaps either through surgery or near drowning, and frankly a range of other causes that can be disease-oriented. So there's a lot of, sadly, there's a lot of different causes of becoming what we might say non-neurotypical, and but many of the consequences for both non-traumatic and traumatic brain injury are similar, and many of the ways to respond to those are similar. And Maggie at the Department of Public Health and the Brain Injury Alliance of Iowa partner with other organizations to try to help people navigate and live well with brain injury.
That's great.
Yeah, that is. Can you tell us about the leading causes that, I mean, you just talked about it a little bit, but what are the leading causes that contribute to brain injury, and how it impacts people at different ages across the lifespan?
Well, falls are the #1 cause of brain injury nationally and here in Iowa. And so with our aging population, they're going to be the ones that are impacted most. So those older Iowans, 65 and older, we see more falls with them. And then we also see falls as being a #1 cause of injury on those very young, so that 0 to 4 population as well.
Go ahead.
No, go ahead, Jeff.
I was going to say, one of the interesting pieces is the good news is that motor vehicle crashes used to be the #1 cause of brain injury, but through highway engineering, through the increase of safety devices from seatbelts to airbags, and just frankly through better engineering of cars, the crush zone in the front, we've had fewer people who end up having significant injuries to the brain. But there's always going to be a #1 cause of brain injury.
Right.
And so in Iowa, we've been able to reduce the causes, the primary cause for motor vehicle, leaving, sadly, falls as the #1 cause. So now we're working on that.
It's just interesting because, you know, I first really became familiar with some of the issues around brain injury when I worked for the Department for the Blind way back when, back in the 80s.
Sure.
And, you know, and at that time, the crashes, and particularly motorcycle crashes, seemed to be the primary, and that was your typical person that you would see. You know, I had a number of people in my caseload that
Right.
had those kinds of accidents. And
Right.
so, you know, and the landscape has certainly changed since then.
Motorcycle riding hasn't gotten much safer since then. It's just that the car crashes, when I talk about motor vehicle crashes being a diminishing cause, we haven't really seen that much of a change with motorcycles. It's mostly the cars and other vehicles that are fully enclosed. In fact, Iowa still has the reputation of being one of very few states that has no helmet law, and it's not a great legacy to leave forward. So we still have a unfortunately high instance relative to the rest of the country of motorcycle crashes that lead to disability.
I'm curious about, I was interested in, you know, you mentioning that a lot of people think about traumatic brain injury when they think about brain injury. And I mean, I certainly, that's, you know, what comes to the top of my mind. But when you talk about falls among older people and falls among, you know, that 0 to 4 population, it seems like it's likely that those don't always present themselves. I mean, there may have been obviously an event that causes it, but that, you know, there might not be immediate symptoms or symptoms that like a layperson would recognize and seek help for. Can you talk more about that?
Well, it maybe in two different ways. So the falls typically, if you don't discern that there's an immediate issue, you probably don't have a acute severe brain injury from falling.
Okay.
With our aging, actually it's not just our aging population, with our population now taking or having access to more prescribed pharmaceutical drugs than probably ever before in our history. Many Americans, or if not most Americans, have had at least one prescription on deck, and many people have multiple prescriptions in the cabinet. There's an increasing risk of those drug interactions leading to either balance issues or just not really thinking through walking backwards down the stairs with your laundry basket. Maybe not backwards,
Right, sure.
but you know, not navigating as well as they could. So polypharmacy is what was what talked about in the medical field. Multiple kinds of drugs on deck can be a problem and a concern. Although our pharmacies are doing a really good job of trying to identify that for people when they have prescriptions. And then just the normal dimensions of aging. People are living longer than they ever had before, and they're living well longer. And so that the natural tendency for us not to remember that if we haven't, for example, my situation last summer, my kids were skateboarding, and I used to be a pretty good skateboarder. And so my intellectual memory is, I can skateboard, but my muscle memory isn't there anymore. So I got on that skateboard and started to go assuming that I'd have all those same balance core, and that it wasn't the case. I didn't have a helmet on, I should have. I didn't fall, but I suddenly had that wake-up call that, maybe this fall I'm not gonna get up onto the second story ladder to clear my leaves. I'll look for somebody who's got better balance. I'm now the guy that I used to suggest at 55, you don't want to be doing your own gutters. Because falls are still falling from ladders, falling downstairs, falling on ice this time of the year. It's often, Caitlin, not well thought. You know, when you fall and think about a traumatic brain injury, people think about hitting their head. But you can fall on your bum, your bottom, and have a shock wave go up the spine and cause a traumatic brain injury, a concussion to the brain. So, to come back to your question, and I don't mean to dominate, but the consequences or the outcomes of having a mild brain injury, also known as a concussion, sometimes don't really become apparent for days later. And people often don't seek health care for just getting their bell rung. And we used to have this model of, you know, you just shake it off, get up and get going. But there are 20 to 30% of people who have a mild brain injury known as a concussion can have lingering effects that can absolutely be supported and served by medical intervention. So we want to encourage people to seek help.
Can those be, I'm curious now, if somebody has had multiple falls, then can they have sort of and it goes untreated? I mean, sometimes I think the changes in a person, especially when they're older, can be kind of subtle. You don't notice them right away, and so it goes untreated, and then they fall again. Is there such a thing as a cumulative effect of multiple falls or multiple concussions?
Absolutely. The literature's unequivocal on this. Having had one concussion from at any age, whether it's a youth athlete playing football or somebody in their 50s or 60s slipping on the ice, the odds of having a second injury are far higher after having a first one. It precipitates or predisposes people to have other injuries, and then on having one on top of the other has a cumulative effect. So there is many times I hear people say, particularly for young athletes, oh, you can get 3 concussions before you have to worry. It's just kind of it's apparently common knowledge in parts of the country. There is no safe number. There's no safe number. So we know in the literature for athletes and for other folks who have multiple concussions that there is an increase in the odds of having scarring and a kind of a deposit of proteins that leads to what's called CTE, or chronic traumatic encephalopathy. The boxers used to call it pugilistic syndrome. And that can lead to an increased risk for Parkinson's and other cognitive difficulties. So, yeah, they're really the only prevention for the outcomes for brain injury. I'm sorry, the only cure for the outcomes for brain injury is prevention.
Makes sense.
It does.
One of the things that you mentioned, one of you mentioned briefly, where you talked about, I guess it was you, Jeff. Well, it doesn't matter. Mentioned the numbers of people who experience significant brain injury to where they're disabled, and we've sort of touched on this already, because we've gone from that spectrum to a concussion where somebody actually may get up in a few days and be back to where they think is normal anyway. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the spectrum? I mean, it's when we use the term brain injury, it sounds like it's a pretty wide functional levels that people have.
You or me?
Go ahead.
Okay. So it is. It is as wide as you can hope to think about it. It's a complex landscape. In terms of trying to think about it discreetly, in the brain injury world, we talk about mild, moderate, and severe injuries, and then try to line up mild, moderate, and severe outcomes. You'd think that they'd overlap, but that's not necessarily the case. There are many times a mild injury can result in a very significant outcome. And there are many people who, because of their genetic predisposition, their level of health, can have a very significant injury, a brain injury, and have a very mild outcome or kind of come out unscathed. There's always that person you knew in high school who might have flipped their car in an Iowa ditch and walked away, very lucky. And that's just, it depends on how the force of the injury happens, whether there's rotation of the brain inside the skull, and a whole range of other factors. The nature of how quickly they got to health care, many different areas impact this. So again, there is no one outcome. You can have a bump on the head that can lead to life-changing disabilities. And there are people who can be knocked unconscious for hours and still appear, after a couple of days to just pop up and look like the Energizer bunnies. It's not a fair injury.
Well, one of the things that I did want to touch on is, because we talked about the only cure for brain injury is prevention. And so at the Department of Public Health, we have a grant right now for some prevention work for falls. And so if people can seek out in their community, typically through the area agencies on aging, they might be able to find out about classes called Matter of Balance. There's one called Stepping On. And then Tai Chi for arthritis is also an evidence-based program for preventing falls. And so those are some good options, especially if somebody has a fear of falling. It'll help give them some of that confidence. And then it also talks about what your risk factors could be, like Jeff was saying about multiple prescriptions or needing a new eyeglass prescription. Do you have things around your home that maybe are tripping hazards, like loose rugs or a small animal? Those kind of things. So like I said, prevention is the only cure for brain injury. So if people are interested in reducing their falls risk, getting signed up for one of those classes is a great option.
Absolutely. I actually took a training, the trainer course on Matter of Balance a few months ago and learned so much about just how that fear of falling can contribute to falls and make people less likely to be active, and all that was really super interesting.
And those are offered through agencies on aging throughout the state of Iowa then?
That's a good place to start to look for information about those classes. Some of the hospitals offer it as well.
So to come back to part of your question, what kind of treatments might be available for people who do encounter either a mild, moderate, or severe brain injury? It's so individualized depending on what part of the brain is injured, the severity of injury, the severity of outcome. However, there is a service in Iowa called Resource Facilitation. We call it Neuro Resource Facilitation. And our wonderful producer, Sujit, will be putting on the screen our 800 number, 855 number, as well as our website at the Brain Injury Alliance of Iowa. Our relationship with the Department of Health has been really productive, and it supports neuro resource facilitators. It's a fee-free service, so there's no cost to people who call, and we will work with individuals on a case-by-case basis to try to unpack where they're at with their life after brain injury and what kind of information, access to services, or supports that they need. And then particularly for people who have cognitive changes or memory changes after brain injury, the program is built to reach back out to them on a regular basis. So every 3 months, we'll touch base with people and say, hey, remember we're still out here? And most people are like, yeah, we know we're out there. We'll call you when we need you. But there's a percentage of people who are like, oh, that's right. This thing has happened in the last 3 months. Have you ever heard of fill in the blank? We also have people who call because they've heard about treatments for brain injury that they may be wondering, does this make sense? So hyperbaric oxygen therapy is a relatively new treatment for brain injury that's gaining an evidence base. It's somewhat expensive and sometimes often not covered by insurance, but the military is using it. And we can give people information so that they can best decide, is this something that I might want to try? How do I find a resource or activity for it, a resource or provider for it? And then what does it cost, and what are the potential benefits? So hyperbaric oxygen therapy, nutritional supplementation, acupuncture. There are some things that, some treatments that are perhaps not as conventional that people might get offered by a physician, but that do show some promise. And one of the themes of our annual conference this year in Des Moines in March is complementary and alternative methods for treatment.
Great.
How do people, I mean, you said that people kind of know you're around, which is great, but how does that, so I've just been injured in the last, I don't know, 2-3 weeks I've spent in the hospital.
Good question.
Or how do those connections typically happen back from the clinical care folks to the neuro-resource facilitators?
Maggie.
Well, the Department of Public Health collects information through our brain injury registry, and from that information then we send out letters letting individuals know about the Brain Injury Alliance Resource Facilitation Program. So when they get that letter, the 800 number that Jeff was talking about, it's 855-444-6443, and individuals can call then to get connected up with one of the resource facilitators. And it's a great program because you get the benefit of their collective knowledge from all the other individuals that they've supported over the years.
There's one more place that we've got. We have more than 270 locations around the state in health clinics, disability service organizations, hospitals, and we call them, we all call them collectively Iowa Brain Injury Resource Network sites, IBRN sites. And through the Department of Health, we're able to maintain this network and stay in constant regular communication, not constant, regular communication through the Brain Injury Alliance, providing them information on what new services, what new training activities there are. But they also then commit to referring people that come through their doors who have brain injury to the Neuro Resource Facilitation Program at the Brain Injury Alliance that's supported by the Department of Public Health.
Yeah, and so people that are familiar with the brain injury program have probably come across one of their resource tote bags, which is a bag filled with informational materials, pamphlets, that kind of thing. So that is their maybe stepping stone into connecting with resource facilitation.
There's one more place that I'll throw out, and if I don't know if this can show up on the screen, but we'll put this up later. For youth with brain injury who are at school age, there's a program that's been endorsed by the Department of Health and the Department of Education called REAP, which stands for Reduce, Remove, Educate, Adjust, and PACE, that really it's a guideline for families, medical professionals, and for kids in school, teachers and educators, to try to navigate the mild brain injury, also known as concussion, and try to help prevent it from having significant or long-lasting outcomes. And so the REAP program is also getting people aware of the Brain Injury Alliance and our 800 number and BIAIA.org, our website, in order for people to refer in to try to help understand and again navigate this unique landscape that is each person's after having a brain injury.
I'm curious, you've shared, I'm sure that all these resources are ones that people, should reach out to in the event that they or a loved one has a brain injury and they're worried, they're not sure, they can't really imagine independence in the community. They can't, in school or employment or, living on their own or, just be, having the level of independence that they would like. Can you share what you might say to them or any other resources that might be out there for them?
Well, there's also several support groups around the state, which if people visit the Brain Injury Alliance website, they can see a listing of where they're at and how to connect with those, as well as, I have to stop, I didn't know. I lost my thought.
No, it's okay. In fact, this is an area that Maggie has a lot of experience. In terms of our resource facilitators, how they might work with somebody, again on a case-by-case basis, but commonly we would visit with people about where they live in Iowa. Our staff we split up the state for our staff so that they become more familiar with certain parts of the state, the regions. and then they'll know, at least locally, what the resources are for people. And if there are no resources in that part of the state, say for example for neuropsychological assessment, they're able to help them navigate, okay, where's the closest location, and then frankly, where are people who might have more experience with your kind of injury, given what we've found out about it. There are, we would then also talk to people about what's their insurance situation. How can we help you advocate with whoever your insurer is to get the services you need? Many insurance companies profess to cover brain injury, but when it comes right down to it, the case management staff or the care coordination staff may not understand exactly what's out there or what's needed. The assessments, for example, that are being used by the state right now for Medicaid program for brain injury are not valid or reliable for brain injury, but they're used because they're allowed to be used by the federal government. We're working with the state to add a brain injury assessment to it, but in the meantime, our resource facilitators are able to help families do or get access to an assessment that they can use to advocate for the services and supports they need. So really we try to help people be working with them to advocate, but also learn how to be strong advocates. Brain injury thrusts people into an environment to have to advocate for themselves in the medical community, in the insurance community, for fiscal resources, for all these areas. And doing that kind of sometimes fly in the face of being Iowa nice. So we're not trying to create non-Iowa nice people, but we are trying to help people get what they need when they need it.
Yeah, well, that's important. And since you mentioned advocacy, I know that we've touched on them a little bit already, talking about the helmet law and the concussion. What are some policy, I know that, I assume anyway, that the Brain Injury Alliance is able to do some policy advocacy. I'm not sure. I know that working with the Department of Public Health, I know that as a state employee, Maggie, you're probably limited, but what kinds of policy issues are out there, and how are people, advocates supporting folks with brain injury, addressing those?
Great question, Mike. So February 8th, by the way, if anybody is available, if this comes out beforehand, we're having our annual Advocacy Day at the State House, and you can get more information about that on our website. We do, over the course of the session, we identify high priorities that are affecting the majority of people with brain injury and their families, and we try to lean into those. This year, as in past years, we encourage and educate the legislature, advocate for increased services and service funding for services for brain injury. In the Medicaid program, that would primarily be in the home and community-based waiver service program, which helps people live at home versus going into institutional care. In the past, we've been able to successfully advocate for tens of millions of dollars of additional funds for the brain injury waiver, which has decreased the waiting list at times down to zero. The waiting list, however, is back up over 1,000 people waiting for 2 years, and so we're going to go back into that again this year. The long-term services and supports for all Iowans with disabilities on Medicaid right now are in, to be kind, a state of tumult. There's probably not been a more chaotic time in Iowa with the advent of a program called managed care that's taken over Medicaid in Iowa. So we're advocating with the legislature to A, fund it appropriately, and then B, managed care so it doesn't negatively impact people with brain injury and all people who depend on long-term services and supports. In the area of concussion, we're asking for, in addition to the current law, which focuses on return to play for student athletes, expanding that concept and talking about having a protocol in all schools for return to learn for students, youth with brain injury, whether it's from traumatic brain injury from athletics or any other cause, playground, fall, anoxia, any of the other possibilities. What else is on our deck? Those are the ones that come top of mind, Mike.
Big policy issues.
So,
sure.
we do, many of the things that affect people with brain injury, policy-wise, affect people with all disabilities. And so we collaborate with the Centers for Disability and Development, with the Iowa Olmsted Consumer Task Force, with the Mental Health and Disability Services Commission, with NAMI, with a range of other collaborators to try to identify what are the big issues policy-wise that are affecting Iowans with disabilities, which ties us back to thanking you for having this kind of a show to get the word out.
Absolutely. Well, we were glad to have you on, and Mike, thank you for having me co-host. I certainly learned a lot during this.
I did too. We could have gone on.
Yeah,
and on,
absolutely.
I'll come back anytime.
Well, that would be good, and I'm sure we'll be in touch on a variety of things, and really appreciate both of you taking your time out. As always, the time just flew by, and want to thank our sponsors once again for their support. Certainly want to thank our viewers and our guests, Maggie and Jeff, and we'll have you back on again sometime soon.
Thanks, Caitlin.
Thank
Thanks,
you.
Mike. And thank you, Maggie, and the Department of Public Health for all your support.